to Bridging the Gap, a commentary on discrimination, marginalization, race, and identity at Duke. I'm your host, Cameron Oglesby, and today we're going to talk about the environment, or more specifically, the gaps that exist in environmental spaces at Duke and at large when it comes to inclusion and representation of individuals of diverse racial or socioeconomic backgrounds. This podcast is going live during April Earth Month here at Duke, 4 weeks where the university's environmental clubs, as well as its primary environmental institution, the Nicolette School of the Environment, goes all out in programming related to engaging people in issues of climate change and environmental degradation. Today, let's also use this Earth Month to take a moment to reflect on progress made and progress yet to come in environmental spaces on campus. You may be asking yourself, why is this important? What does this have to do with race or identity? Looking back at the racial reckoning that took place in summer 2020, there was also a moment of dialogue that took place in environmental spaces. Over the past several years, the world has rallied behind the fight against climate change around the youth climate movement and the climate justice movement. But this past summer, as the institutions which govern our society were called out for the injustices against people of color, so too did the larger environmental movement experience a reckoning. Activists like Leah Thomas, Green Girl Leah as she's called, pushed forward the intersectional environmentalism movement to an extent not previously seen. Green organizations realized that their fight to save the earth often excluded disadvantaged communities. We've even seen a shift at the presidential level in acknowledging the importance of environmental justice work when talking about climate change. This episode of Bridging the Gap hopes to draw a connection between justice and the environment, as well as highlight the systems in place at Duke that often leave students of diverse backgrounds out of the conversation. Before we get started, I want to note 3 things. 1. If you're not at all interested in the environment, do not fret. Although this episode focuses on our eco-centered spaces, the implications are wide-reaching. The themes we'll discuss and the trends our guests will highlight are not unique or exclusive to the environmental field, but speak to larger trends surrounding what are often under-supported communities and identities in predominantly white spaces. Number 2. Full disclosure, I'm an environmental science and policy major at Duke. I was also Director of Environmental Affairs and Policy for Duke Student Government, President of the Undergraduate Environmental Union, and an undergraduate representative on the Board of Trustees Climate Change and Sustainability Task Force for school year 2020-2021. This is a bit of context into me and my stake in this conversation. As I was planning the Bridging the Gap series, I couldn't help but stick an environmental episode in here. So please note that I come to this episode from a place of experience. But I'm also not impartial as one of the very few Black women in leadership positions in these environmental spaces. I will not speak to specific instances of tokenization or ignorance I've witnessed at the various levels in these spaces, high and low. But perhaps that statement right there is a hint that these issues are happening. Number 3. Last, but certainly not least, is our land acknowledgement. We here at Bridging the Gap want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that the Greater University occupies as the ancestral lands of the Shakori, Ino, and Catawba Indian peoples. If you are not currently on campus, we encourage you to take a moment to recognize the traditional owners in your area. So, jumping right in 2019, I had the pleasure of interviewing Danielle Purifoy, former Duke Nicolette School PhD candidate and African and African American Studies scholar. She currently works as assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her work focuses on the disparity in treatment, development, and investment in predominantly Black spaces as compared to white communities, and which often results in unequal access to green space or environmental amenities and a disproportionate exposure to health-damaging industries and pollutants. Her work is the study of environmental injustice and justice, a movement that is said to have started in North Carolina a little over an hour away from Duke in Warren County. About a year later, Danielle has allowed us to share some of the audio from that original interview. Please note that the sound quality of this recording is a little rough, given it was not originally intended for this podcast, but her message still rings true. Let's take a listen.
The history of what we think of now as environmentalism, what sort of has morphed in academia as environmental studies, has a really problematic history, as actually most academic disciplines do have a pretty racist history, right? And one of the things that I think continues to be a challenge is a kind of a refusal, and this kind of doesn't really matter which environmental space you're in. It could be in the academy, it could be in a nonprofit setting, it could be in a kind of social club. Kind of the refusal to think about the history of environmentalism, to think about where conservation and preservation comes from, and who was actually excluded from even the sort of thought of participation, right, in that movement, or who was actually thought as antagonistic to nature preservation. I think environmentalism is racist pretty much everywhere, right? But there's a way in which in other contexts, there's just a difference in the multiplicity of voices that are present, right? So there are colonial legacies, right, abroad and outside of the United States and within the United States, let's be clear, right? But when we see our curriculum at Duke and at other places, right, the people of color that we see reflected are often folks from contexts outside of the United States, which is fantastic, but it also means something about what's happening within the United States, and we don't talk about that as often. So, there is, and what that means is that it has consequences for who sees themselves as welcome in the profession, right? Who sees themselves as being a viable environmentalist in this space. And there's also the inattention to the kind of issues that I study, right? Black communities are still seen very much as disposable, throwaway communities, and the kinds of environmental hazards and issues that face those communities aren't seen as the primary concern of environmentalists. They might oppose a particular coal-fired power plant, but for instance, right? But their rationale about it is quite different than it would be for the communities that are the most impacted by them. To be a part of this field is that we're constantly coming up against theories and rationales for why we care about the earth, right, and care about the environment that are very contradictory, right, to our lives, actually, to our survival, to our health, to our sense of place. I don't think that where we are with environmentalism right now will ever get us to a resolution for climate change. I don't think, because I don't think that it's broad enough, and I don't think that it understands itself as, even if it says that it does, I don't think it actually in practice operates for all of us. It's still operating in that mode where there are some places that are just disposable.
In conversations we've had with Duke faculty and students about the academic and extracurricular environmental opportunities here, the primary gaps they point out are around a lack of environmental justice course options, a lack of student representation as a result of that curriculum, and a lack of diverse faculty perspectives. All of this seeps together to create a community by which certain students don't feel comfortable in environmental spaces, inside or outside the classroom, and which ultimately drives them away from environmental opportunities at Duke. Today, we're going to hear from two students, Lizette Araya, a junior and exec member of Duke's Mi Gente Latinx Student Club, and Maya Ghanem, a sophomore and member of Duke's Muslim Student Association. They both came to Duke interested in studying environmental topics, and both ultimately decided to go another way. First, we hear from Lizette. She is a global health and psychology double major who only recently decided to tack on an environmental science minor. She discusses some of her first campus experiences that ended up shaping her decision not to pursue an environmental science degree.
So I guess I can start from when I first entered Duke. I came in with the intention of actually being an environmental science major. And so, I kind of built my schedule around that. I didn't find that my environmental science classes were as engaging, I guess, as, some of my other classes. And I don't know, I think that part of it had to do with, maybe it was just the specific class, because I actually didn't take very many environmental science classes before I ended up, changing my major, or my intended major. But I just felt that they weren't necessarily I couldn't really relate to them, I guess. Whereas my other classes were I took a class called the cultural politics of food, which was super duper interesting and brought in so many different angles and perspectives. And I really love that intersectionality, I guess, approach. And when I was in environmental science, it was just here are some policies, here are some environmental problems, and we need solutions and all that stuff, the general things that you usually hear. And so I guess that's kind of where I decided to, switch my major. But I mean, I've always been really passionate about, the planet, and I've always understood the urgency of, taking care of the environment and everything. But I felt that maybe majoring in it was just not my thing. And I was just interested in other things outside of classes and coursework. And the major, since freshman year, I joined Duke Climate Coalition, and they've been really great. And it's been, and I don't want to say it it's directly them or anything. And I don't. Duke Climate Coalition is all I can speak on, but I'm sure this is not directly them. I don't want to attack them and stuff, because I am still in it, and I still do do things through them. So I'm not saying that it's bad or anything. I do remember that I walked in and I was one of the very few people of color. I don't even remember how many other people I noticed that were people of color, but I think it was just the majority white people, and then there were a few Asian people. I did not see another Latinx person. Don't remember seeing any Black people or Native people. And so that, I was kind of used to that, because I came from a high school where it was kind of predominantly white. So it wasn't that off-putting, but it also, during that time, I was also starting to get really engaged within the Latinx community at Duke. And so it was just I had already gotten used to being in the Latinx spaces and engaging with all of my new Latinx friends. And then I would go to the Climate Coalition meetings, and then it would just be so vastly different. And I'd be wait, why isn't why don't I see more of people of color in these spaces? And so, I just kept going to the meetings, kept pushing through, because I was what, this is important to me. And at one point, going into my sophomore year, I was involved in one of their project teams a lot. And going into my sophomore year, they offered me a sort of a leadership position to lead one of the project teams. And I remember I just kind of shied away from it. And I was I told them I wasn't really comfortable being the leader. And I think there are two reasons for that. and I think one main one, and then that's the just like, I guess something that like a lot of people experience, but this whole like imposter syndrome thing where you don't really feel like you are like deserve to be in a certain position, or maybe like you don't feel like you're qualified to take on a certain position, and that's kind of how I felt. And part of it is like, I'm a first generation low income student, so like it was like that on top of me just going to a school like Duke where there's not a lot of people like me there, on top of joining this organization that's like predominantly white, and like a lot of people like me, and just in general, like even broader, like the environmental movement in general is like stereotypically, I guess, a predominantly white space. So it was just kind of like all of these like confounding factors that just kind of like made me feel like I was like, I'm a little confused why you're asking me to lead this project team, because it was like I don't see myself, like I never really thought that I was like someone to be like qualified to do that. And I still sort of feel that like to this day, although like it's definitely like gotten better. But I'm still kind of like trying, like I'm a junior now, and I don't think that, I have found a space where I can feel like there are people like me that are working towards the issues that people in my community face, but also incorporating like an environmental, like justice lens.
The experience Lizette described in environmental clubs is not unique to Duke Climate Coalition. Of the 16 or so undergraduate environmental organizations that exist at Duke at a given time, the vast majority are composed of white students. That percentage gets bigger as you ascend into environmental leadership positions, faculty and administrative spaces even more so. This year, President Price called together a climate change and sustainability task force created to determine best practices as the university looks to move forward and become the climate change university. Of the 24 listed members of the task force, only 4 are people of color. 3 of the participants are Black. This is not to say that progress on environmental justice and climate change issues does not occur without a diverse decision-making body. But perhaps a more diverse group would allow for more nuanced conversation, for varied dialogue surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion that goes deeper than a stated acknowledgement of the issue. In September 2019, I reached out to the former undergraduate program coordinator for the environmental science and policy and earth and ocean science majors to understand the demographics of the programs. The numbers were as follows. Of 98 majors and minors, 2 were Native American, 5 were Black or African American, 5 considered themselves multiracial, 15 identified as Latino, 19 as Asian, and 52 as Caucasian. I want to make clear that this disparity does not fall solely on Duke's shoulders. As previously mentioned, the environmental movement as a whole has struggled for decades with its perception of and inclusion of people of color and those of low-income backgrounds. Some say that the implicit racism and discrimination within environmental spaces came to the forefront with the idealization of John Muir, the father of our national parks and the founder of one of the most influential environmental nonprofits in the country, the Sierra Club. In the late 1800s, John Muir established nature as something to protect, while at the same time ostracizing Black and Indigenous communities as something other, savage, and as something that did not belong out in pristine natural spaces. Many early Sierra Club members and leaders were vocal advocates for white supremacy and eugenics. David Starr Jordan, for example, served on the club's board of directors during Muir's presidency and pushed for forced sterilization laws and programs that deprived tens of thousands of mostly Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and poor women of their right to bear children. Let's keep in mind that this history lesson is not designed to, in any way, diminish environmental injustices in this country to a single individual or group. Like all forms of racial discrimination and injustice, these issues are based out of a multitude of systemic malpractices. But some say this was one of many starting points. From that point forward, the relationship between nature and people were wholly separate. Back in the mid to late 1900s, the traditional environmental movement at the time was myopically focused on wilderness conservation and endangered species, not people or the needs of urban communities. At the same time, the environmental justice movement was rising up to fight air and water pollution from industries that disproportionately set up camp near low-income communities and communities of color. Environmentalism became a comparison between fighting for the dolphins or the polar bears and fighting for human lives. And that disparity has carried over into the way environmental topics are taught and the way that environmental clubs and organizations are structured. Let's circle back to Lizette to learn more about why the environmental community for her fell flat compared to the work she did for Mi Gente.
A lot of the people in Mi Gente come from a very similar background. Obviously, like there's the obvious like cultural thing, but even without that, a lot of us come from like low income, predominantly first gen backgrounds. And so there's just this, I can't really put my finger on exactly what it is, but there's just kind of this environment of like support and just kind of, you know, I just feel very welcome and like respected, and like my voice and opinion in those spaces like matter. And again, I don't really know what it is about it. It's just the vibe that I get from those spaces. And then when I, especially at Duke, when I'm in like predominantly white spaces, you know, we know that the especially white demographic at Duke is kind of more wealthy. And it's just, I don't really get that vibe. And I'm not saying that they're like doing it on purpose, that they're like ostracizing me or anything like that. Like, I don't think that's necessarily true, but I do get this vibe where I don't know, I just don't feel like as welcome and as comfortable, I guess, expressing myself as I do in like Latinx spaces. So I think that's kind of like the difference in terms of like why I maybe feel comfortable being in a leadership position in one space versus another. But yeah, I guess in terms of gaps, in terms of like what, you know, each organization stands for, like Mi Gente and like environmental organizations. Yeah, I mean, I you know, the common trend with environmental movements and organizations is that they just don't really have that much of a focus on environmental justice. And if they do, it's kind of like a very secondary thing. Like the biggest focus is like environmental, like big picture sort of climate change things. And then kind of like a subcategory is like, oh yeah, and then there's also this thing of environmental justice. When in reality, like I think environmental justice is one of the main cruxes of the environmental movement. And it's definitely not given as much attention as it should. I guess maybe that's why, like, I also don't feel qualified, because I'm like, well, I feel like I represent people in Mi Gente because, you know, they're similar to me, but then in environmental organizations, I don't see how the work that I'm doing here is like affecting people from backgrounds like me. And so I feel like that's one of the major gaps of, you know, in a lot of environmental organizations at Duke and just in white spaces in general, is that, you know, it's not that people of color don't care about environmental issues or anything like that. It's just that there isn't a space for us in those groups, in those demographics, that like it doesn't feel like we can really do much for our communities. I think a lot of people of color kind of just stay away from environmental movements because they're like, well, I can make my voice heard and make more of a difference in this other space. So I'm just going to stick to that.
Maya Ghanem is a Lebanese Syrian-American identifying sophomore and a Program 2 student who described a similar gap.
I think since I was really, really young, I've always been interested in the environment and I cared a lot about climate change. I remember like as a very young, I think like in elementary school, we learned about, you know, recycling and the ice caps are going to melt and the polar bears. And like all of that was it was very important to me. And it led me to try to care about conservation, but it always felt very like abstract and distant. Like the effects of climate change seemed so far in the future back then, didn't really feel tangible. So that was just something that I noticed since I was young. But then once I visited Lebanon for the first time, I think I visited in like 2008. I think that was the first time where I realized that like climate change, air pollution, environmental disasters they have tangible impacts on people now. Like it's something that is happening to a lot of people right now. It's not something abstract. And when I realized that, I also saw that that the reality of environmental disasters are very different for people in Lebanon than they were for my affluent community back home. When I was in Lebanon, I was there in the height of the garbage politics scandal. This was basically the government in Lebanon is very corrupt, but it was to the point where they didn't have waste management, basic waste management, and they just like didn't throw away their trash. They like just threw it on the beaches. There was no system there in place. And eventually the government decided to burn their trash just into the atmosphere. And that was horrible for the atmosphere there. It released so much pollution, so many greenhouse gases. And, that's something that was very tangible for the Lebanese people. Trash that wasn't burned was piled along our beautiful coastline. And that was something that was really difficult to see. And, like the air pollution there, there is a tangible difference between Lebanon and Thousand Oaks, which is where I live in America. And that was I think that was when I started to realize like certain populations really they live with these consequences now, and they were living with it before. So that's when I realized like climate change is not a future thing. It's something that's happening now. In terms of the environmental space outside of the environmental justice community, at Duke, I will say that I have felt that it's definitely a very white dominated space. And I never really, I tried to get involved in a few environmental clubs in my freshman year, but I wanted to focus on the Middle East, and I never really felt that there was a space for that. So I kind of just decided to become involved with Middle Eastern organizations, Muslim organizations instead. My program too is environmental health and justice, and I'm going to focus on the Middle East and North Africa as a comparative study with the United States. And the main reason I want to do program two is because I wanted to have more of a focus on the Middle East, and I didn't feel like the environmental science major really allowed space for that as much. I just think that it would be nice to see more of different regions and different identities represented within the environmental curriculum.
Moving on to the context of environmental academia, more specifically, the university's robust environmental programs through the Nicholas School of the Environment, as well as entities like the Nicholas Institute for Policy Solutions and the Energy Initiative, act as shining examples for traditional environmental excellence. But in fall 2020, several graduate students at the Nicholas School came together and drafted a petition demanding that the institution improve upon its work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and support of its students of color. Here is an excerpt from that petition, which refers to the moment of racial reckoning that took place in summer 2020.
These inequalities are embedded in the environmental sciences and in the history of Duke University as an institution. The current reality of the racial diversity of the Nicholas School shows the lengths we must go to address racial inequalities within our own community. Our students, faculty, and staff are harmed by the lack of racial diversity in our program. As a result, students receive an imbalanced and lower quality education, perpetuating poor cross-cultural communication skills, historical ignorance, and feeding into continued systemic oppression. If we take seriously the charge that it falls on all of us to help change America for the better, we must realize that the history and practices of science and conservation have ties to white supremacy. We must take concrete steps, changing our culture, curricula, resources, and recruitment practices in order to reach those stated goals. Systemic racism cannot be solved by merely holding events that promote selective empathy or by burdening a few respected and overworked faculty members and students to educate others. The Nicolette School of the Environment has an obligation to genuinely and transparently support its Black students, faculty, staff, and community members.
Ranikumar, whose voice you just heard, was one of the student leaders in the creation of that petition. A second-year Master's of Environmental Management student, she shared her insights into the graduate environmental community at Duke.
The reality of the Nicolette School is that even before, a whole year ago, before any of the actions this summer, the reckoning, quote unquote, has been going on after the murder of George Floyd, students of color at the Nicolette School were already having these conversations. My second day walking in the door, I had a conversation with students of color that I saw about like, wow, this sort of interaction just happened to me, or somebody has told me that I have to join X club that represents diversity because I am X member of diverse group. And so for this whole time that I've been at the Nicolette School, students of color have been really concerned and like working on these issues. And just things that would come up in class and sort of just these problematic things that we saw throughout the school. So it wasn't really a question of like, oh, like we need to sit here and think of like what's going on with ourselves after we are awakened from what's happening in our country. It was like, no, this has been going on at the Nicolette School for so long, and we are just like sort of the most recent students to sort of encounter this. And I hate to say the word like trying to capitalize on the energy, but it wasn't really even that. It was sort of like, this is a moment where we need to speak up and say like, hey, we can't just pretend that everything's fine here too. The Nicolette School has been like really willing and tempting to listen to this. And I think, some people have been in their roles for like a short amount of time. So it's definitely, again, it's always that story of like, oh, it takes time to do these things. I think the reality is when you look at peer institutions that the Nicolette School is, I would say like, I don't even know how many years behind, but like, if you look at the University of Michigan, they've already had this like really statement of like, and like effort towards like equitable institution decolonizing their curriculum for like 5 years plus now. And, the Nicolette School is starting it today after they sort of have this national reckoning. So I guess the feeling is like, yes, it's great to have a response and it's great to have people say that they're committed. It's just, kind of sad that it took the like literal, people in the streets, people sort of having this dramatic awakening to really have people move at the Nicolette School, because it's not like these conversations weren't happening before.
I will note that the institution responded favorably to the grad students' demands, hosting several open forums to address student concerns and faculty questions directly. And to her credit, Dean Toddy Steelman has done an excellent job of remaining engaged and acting as an advocate for environmental justice and greater faculty representation at the Nicolette School. In March, the Nicolette School hired its first Indigenous faculty member to officially join the institution in early 2022, and whose expertise works at the intersection of hydrology and environmental justice. Environmental justice topics have been sprouting up in introductory environmental coursework and in joint faculty, staff, and student spaces. And several students have worked over the last couple years to create an environmental justice house course for those interested in learning more about such topics. Let's hear from Rebecca Vitra, senior lecturer in the Nicolette School and director of the Duke Environmental Leadership Program. She's been one faculty advocate for incorporating environmental justice into the curriculum, was the advisor for the Environmental Justice House course this past fall, and helped create a North Carolina-focused environmental justice Duke Engage program for this upcoming summer.
So I was really inspired this summer by the organization of students around the organizing of students around pressing the Nicholas School to do more in the environmental justice space. I was impressed that it was sort of a groundswell, grassroots activism. As somebody who studies that and hopes for that and around environmental issues, it was kind of cool to witness it happening in our own community. And I think the Nicholas School has responded mostly adequately, but I think we all recognize that a lot of change has to happen, and it's not just, there's no one solution. That, we have a whole long list of things that we could be doing, and we're going to need different people to be working in these different spaces. We're going to need to do this in partnership with our students and with our staff and with our community. This is not easy to fix. It's not just going to get fixed by the hiring of one person or even a cluster of people. Like, this is like systemic change, and it's not easy. I'm sort of optimistic. I think people are like honestly wanting to engage, and that's important, because I think once we start to disengage, then we're going to lose the momentum.
There is good happening, but the progress is slow. A concern for students like Ronnie, who are noticing the momentum dwindling and fear these pushes will only continue to lose traction the further out people get from the protests last summer.
So the moving on is already happening, and I can already feel it in myself too, right? The semester comes, and the first meeting, I don't remember how many we had. We had 200 plus people on the call when Dean Toddy was like talking about these things. The last meeting, there was maybe 30, and half of the people were people who worked on the petition. There's a racial justice ARC seminar that was put in place in response to the petition, and the people who are taking the course are the people, the 20 people, half of them worked on the petition. So it's that there was high interest in the student body and in the faculty. And I think, to their credit, I think the faculty are staying interested, and so is the administration. The reality is it has faded and people aren't as interested. And, if you're able to step back because you're not directly impacted by it, then you step back, and that's the unfortunate. And even myself, right? There's moments when I've had to take a step back because I want to get my econ homework done, or I want to get my GIS homework done. It's already happening.
We spoke to Nicolette Cagle, the Nicholas School's Director of Undergraduate Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and an environmental science and policy lecturer, to understand what the Nicholas School needs to improve on specifically.
So when we look at faculty, staff, and students of the Nicholas School, we notice that there is severe underrepresentation of people of color in our students and faculty. That's something that we can see. And by people of color, I'm referring to Blacks, Indigenous people, and Latinos in an American context. And I think it's important that we differentiate diversity that's kind of homegrown American versus international scholars, because we're talking about two different things there. The Nicholas School isn't unique in these disparities, but we see them, and for a long time, the administration has wanted to have success in reducing those disparities and actually bringing in robust numbers of people of color into the Nicholas School. And we've had strategic plans saying these things since the early 2000s at least. And it is difficult to know which strategies are most effective and to have funding for those strategies and to have champions for those strategies. And I think that's where the Nicholas School is right now, is that we've been in this holding pattern of recognizing there's a problem in the environmental fields more generally. We've got tons of data on that now. And not quite knowing what to do, writing a plan and then not fully implementing it, or implementing things for a couple of years and it not working or not having the desired outcome. And one of the things I feel like the Nick School is doing differently now is recognizing that it's not just a numbers game, right? Our goal shouldn't be to bring in people of color into the Nicholas School just so that we can have statistics that say we've got people of color in the Nicholas School. Our goal needs to be actually creating an inclusive environment where everybody's voices are heard, where everybody has power in the system, and where people can actually succeed. And so we're shifting to creating those conditions for success right now, instead of just trying to recruit without providing any social support, without having any modes for true inclusion. So I think that's a big change in the last couple of years. It did take me a ton of time and study to get where I am. And I've got to say that I still don't feel that I'm anywhere close to where I need to be in my understanding of issues around identity and inclusion. I will always need to work at this. And that is because of my identity. I am white, middle-class, cisgender woman. I spent a lot of my life not having to think about these issues. And I will have to spend the rest of my life making up for that deficit. And so in a school where a lot of people come from similar backgrounds to me, a lot of people are white, a lot of faculty are white, a lot of them come from middle-class backgrounds, not everybody. Some come from upper-class backgrounds. Quite a few come from lower socio-economic classes as well. But we all just need to do work throughout the rest of our lives in order to understand these issues. So in terms of actual training in the Nicholas School, for a long time, we didn't have a required training. We had opt-in training. And there has always been this core of, 15 or maybe even 20 faculty members that are like all in, and you see them. They're at every training, and they have been for 10 years, right? Or more. And they are into it, and they are reading, and they are doing the self-reflection. And then you have other folks where this hasn't been a priority. So one of the things that we're starting to do in the Nicholas School just this year, and this is as a direct result of the petition for racial equity that the Nicholas School received, we are now requiring some trainings for understanding why this stuff, and what I mean by this stuff is understanding human difference, techniques for creating inclusive environments, why this stuff is important. And so those opportunities are being developed more and more, but there is a ton of energy around it this year, more energy than I've ever seen in my time at the Nicholas School. I think that this energy has definitely derived from the protests this summer. But more importantly, the students stood up and very clearly told us what they wanted. There is no ignoring that, in my opinion, beautiful petition that came out from the student body. It needed to be addressed. I think there's a diversity of opinions and approaches in the Nicholas School to how environmental justice could or should be included in the curriculum. There is a group of extraordinarily committed faculty that have been on committees before, have been on committees thinking about and evaluating our curriculum in terms of environmental justice, thinking about ways that we could include more environmental justice coursework, thinking about ways that we can include more environmental justice themes into our classes. But they're a relatively small group, again, of maybe 10 folks that are really committed, interested, and knowledgeable about these things. I think that in the Nicholas School, there tends to be hesitancy to include subjects in the curriculum for which we don't have an expert on faculty. So we don't have an environmental justice focused faculty member. And that means who teaches a course on environmental justice. So right now, the Nicholas School has a graduate level course open on environmental justice. We bring in someone from the outside to teach that. But for a course that we can't guarantee is going to be taught every year because that person isn't a faculty member, it almost doesn't seem like appropriate to include an environmental justice component as a required part of the curriculum. For folks that are committed to environmental justice like me, but that's also not my area of specialization. I'm an ecologist by training. It also seems wrong from a faculty perspective to be teaching issues about which we're not experts. And so I think that some of the hesitancy that we see in the Nicholas School is we talk about white supremacy culture norms or just norms of academic culture. Being right, being the expert, that hierarchy of knowledge is really strong in the academic community. And people don't want to misstep. They don't want to promise things that they can't deliver. And so getting over or pushing past the hurdles of academic culture and hierarchy is a very important step for us to increase the amount of environmental justice we're seeing in the curriculum. Another important step is to actually hire an environmental justice professor and kind of create this environmental justice curriculum or pod or focus in the Nicholas School. That would solve a lot of these issues.
So, why is this representation important? It ensures that the institution is being considerate in its work. It ensures that assumptions are not made about the way the university can and should interact with communities, and that the university doesn't take an I know best attitude when it decides to implement a project outside of its walls. And most importantly, a mind to representation ensures that any student can come to Duke and feels comfortable exploring the issues that most resonate with them. I'll save our discussion of solutions to these problems for part 2 in our environment episode. But before we go, as always, we like to end with a poem. This piece is a duo poem by Kenya Newsom and Nesha Ruther as a part of the Split This Rock 2015 DC Youth Slam. It is a back and forth and a duet of environmental degradation from the perspective of white and black communities. This is environmental justice.
When the end of the world comes, where will we be? Probably at home, in the middle-class suburb of Tacoma Park, Maryland, eating an organic dinner bought from our local co-op. My privilege pressing hard through plates and window panes, I won't feel the effects of the crumbling world my parents have worked so hard to preserve.
I live in D.C., where murder rates topple skyscrapers looking over your shoulder is a natural reflex, and in the end, my melanin's never able to save me.
Because even Mother Nature has begun to discriminate. She is sinking under toxic waste landfills built by men who look like me.
And poor neighborhoods full of people who look like me.
Does she know only some of her children are dying?
Black kids are raised in so many different types of fear. Trained to count the days until dirt as dark as melanin will swallow us whole.
I have the good fortune of not fearing the people around me, so I tend to the ground beneath me, saving water and electricity, but I won't feel the deep-rooted damage like she will, like oppressed people everywhere will.
People in power dispose of waste where no one important will go looking.
Where no one important is living.
Out of sight, out of mind. Not knowing where your trash is going is a privilege.
Exhale out chemicals someone else will breathe in. Kettleman City, California. Kettleman Hills Hazardous Waste receives a grant to expand their landfill.
In a city where 96% of the population is of Latino descent,
minorities have always been seen as more trash than treasure, turning towns into dumping ground. Because if a population is dark, it must be dirty. When the end of the world comes, at first, only a few will go with it.
My people are always the first to die, and the last remember. But what happens when there are no more black bodies to burn?
Who will be the next the earth will swallow before the tornadoes turn great cities into dust bowls and there is no one left to inherit our destruction? We will both go dust to dust, both just want a world where our children can grow. Our generation is one of unlearning prejudice.
When a second chances of standing together.
There are reparations to be made, healing the earth and all people on it.
Seeds to be sown in the ground and in communities.
Too much to do that we can't do alone, that we can't do until we both are equal, till we are breathing the same air,
Drinking the same water.
seeing past our own privilege, and seeing each other.
Thank you for joining us for this latest episode of Bridging the Gap. Please be sure to tune in for part 2 in our Eco Experiences episodes, where we'll dive a bit deeper into best practices for overcoming the diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice gaps in environmental spaces at Duke. See you next time.